Welcome, everyone. My name is Margaret Stern, and I am the Operations Manager at Print and Matter. We're thrilled to present a conversation between artist Josephine Meckseper and curator Paulina Pobocha, centered on Meckseper's new monograph, published by Sternberg Press and Frac du Pays de la Loire. Meckseper was born in Germany and has lived and worked in New York since the early 1990s. She is known for large-scale installations, sculptural vitrines, and films, which she has shown in numerous international museum shows and biennials. Pobocha is a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, where she focuses on art made after 1960. As you will see from their conversation, Josephine and Paulina share many interests, particularly the history of modernism, as it intersects with the history of 20th century Germany. Today, they will explore the artist's complex family narrative, contextualize interwar and post-war German art, and discuss Josephine's exhibition at the Frac. They will talk for about 45 minutes, and afterwards there will be time for Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions via the Zoom Q&A feature throughout their conversation. This conversation will be recorded and available at a later date. And so now Josephine and Paulina will join us.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Margaret, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Josephine, for joining me tonight for this conversation.
Hello, everyone.
So I think just in the interest of time, we have so much material to cover that we should jump right in to the first slide. And here what we're seeing are two installation images from your 2019 survey exhibition organized by Frac in France. And it's an exhibition that took place across two venues. On the left, you see an install shot from Frac Carquefou, and on the right from Frac's HAB Galerie in Nantes. And the exhibition was a survey of about 14 years of your work and included the vitrines that you're very well known for, the sea prints, large-scale installations, as well as several films.
Thank you for introducing the work, and thank you, Paulina and Print and Matter and Margaret, for doing the talk. The two-venue exhibition was really partly informed by the abandoned industrial landscape and old shipping cranes surrounding the exhibition venue in Nantes. And the spaces were quite big and stretched over 20,000 square foot, and therefore I included more of my large-scale sculptures and vitrines from between 2002 and 2016.
And another feature of this exhibition is that the director of the Frac, Laurence Gatteau, who organized this show with you, also invited you to have a look at works in the Frac's collection and include them alongside your own work in the exhibition. If we go to the next slide, we'll see a sampling of those works. And here we're actually looking at a spread from the book's catalog. On the left-hand side, you see a shelf with 3 objects on it. Those are, from left to right, works by Valie Export, by Sherrie Levine, and by Martha Rossler. And on the right side, we have 3 prints by artist and activist Corita Kent. And these are from the 60s. It's really lovely to see those included in the exhibition. And from what I've seen, and I didn't see the show in person, but just from looking at the catalog and various installation images, is that you really tended to focus on work by women artists, and especially artists with whom you share an affinity. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the selection process and how you picked what you picked.
Yeah, sure. The concept for the show was to intersect my artworks with the works from the Frac's collection, which in part were actually exhibited on industrial-looking shelves that are specifically designed for the exhibition. But I was also looking at reversing the ratio of male and female artists from the quite male-dominated institution's collection. And so some of the 20 artists that I included, for example, were Monica Bonvicini, Melanie Counsell, Louise Lawler, Jack Pearson, and Rosemarie Trockel.
And I thought what was really interesting is that in the essay in the catalog, Joshua Decter, who wrote the essay, described the exhibition as a type of macro vitrine. And I think that was just such a kind of spot on description, because it really is the exhibition in the way that he's described it is almost an amplification of the kind of processes that are already at work in your individual vitrines. And by that, I mean, in many of your vitrines, you include objects that evoke the work of other artists. If we can go to the next slide. And this gesture, this kind of the inclusion of work by other artists, Decter had described in his words as acknowledging that an artist's work is never completely autonomous, that it is always contingent upon networks of artists, discursive connections, institutional approvals, and who is included or excluded from histories of art, among other conditions. And so in the image on the left, we're looking again at this installation shot of Frac Carquefou, and in the center is one of your vitrines, where, as I mentioned before, you have objects that evoke the work of other artists. And here, the kind of abstract column on the left very clearly reminds one of Constantine Brancusi's Endless Column. But what interests me most is this confrontation with this big vitrine and this little tiny object that's barely visible just to the work's right. And what you see in the slide on the right is what that little rectangle in fact is. And it is a work by the kind of collaborative Claire Fontaine. And what we're seeing is a brick that's wrapped in a book jacket. And the book jacket, I'm not going to try to pronounce this in French, but I will give you the English translation. The title of this book is Thrive Despite Your Depression. So it's a sort of self-help book, and it's a self-help book wrapped around a brick. Again, kind of facing off with this large vitrine. And I wondered if you wanted, it's almost like the central drama of this room. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about how you decided to pair these two objects together.
Yeah, I was really interested in creating an expanded conceptual dialogue between the curated artworks from the collection and how I approach the content and narratives in my vitrine works.
You know, the making of art, or, you know, the process is for artists to live during these different times, but it's also interesting to look at this, you know, in terms of, you know, the moment in Nantes in 2019 was really the height of the Yellow Vest movement, and how that was, you know, perceived by the public at that time. And, you know, it was important to me to kind of create a link to these real life moments, so that, you know, the viewer who entered these institutions were, you know, had, you know, sort of entry into the work.
Yeah, and I also find the kind of added aspect of the title and this kind of book cover, because Thrive Despite Your Depression, with this woman's face on it, it's sort of, you know, it's a evocation of or a nod to self-help books. And I think this idea of the self-help book wrapping a brick, it also kind of invokes a sense of agency. You know, if you don't like the world that you're living in, you know, change it, and maybe change it through radical means. At least that's what the
in many ways, I mean, the works that we're discussing in this lecture are so much about sort of how artists process trauma or inequality and social injustice. And there's so much of that right now that, you know, we are all kind of living through this incredibly difficult and changing time, that it's interesting to now look at artworks that also dealt in their time with huge challenges and difficulties.
I think that's really interesting with your work, and I think what you do so well is weave this kind of present kind of urgencies through history, and kind of bring out the kind of, or maybe highlight moments, historical moments that have kind of echoes in the present. And I think you'll see a little bit of what I'm talking about if we look at the next sculpture in the next slide. And this is a really terrific work. It's called Ich war, ich bin, ich werde sein. You can tell that I'm not a native German speaker. but those were the last known written words by the philosopher and revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg before she was murdered in January 1919. And they translate into English, I was, I am, and I shall be. And so I'm just kind of curious about where this title comes from, why you titled it in, why evoke Rosa Luxemburg, and also how it relates to both the structure of the vitrine itself and its contents.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this vitrine from 2014, was really conceived having in mind a museum exhibition that I was having in Aachen, and Aachen being the birthplace of Mies van der Rohe, really sort of instrumentalized the overall appearance of the steel and glass vitrine. But I was really also struck by, when I was researching his work, that he had actually built and dedicated a monument to the November Revolution, which is sort of like the synonym for the killing of Rosa Luxemburg.
I'm going to stop you, just if we can go to the next slide, just because you'll see a preparatory drawing for this monument, and you'll see the Ich war, ich bin, ich werde sein written in.
Exactly. He included the slogan that, is the last words basically of Rosa Luxemburg into the monument. And 10 years after he built this was like a big brick monument. It was demolished and declared degenerate art by the fascist regime. Mm-hmm. So when we go one slide forward, we see, how in the vitrine I also included a monument that was built in a very similar brick style from 1919 called the Niedersachsenstein, which happens to be located in my hometown, and it is the only surviving expressionist sculpture in Germany that was not destroyed by the Nazi regime. So I think in many ways I'm sort of creating this kind of very layered work with this vitrine, but that also happens to connect to my personal history.
Mm-hmm. It also connects, to me, I think what's interesting is that it also connects the World War I and World War II in a sort of roundabout way via the Mies van der Rohe monument, which was destroyed in 1935 by the Nazis. And this work on the right, which is a sculpture that was built by an artist, Bernhard Hoetker, and it was a monument to fallen soldiers of World War I. And so there is that kind of implicit connection there, at least to me, about the consequences of Germany losing the First World War and how that in fact helped fed, let's say, the rise of fascism.
And as we were talking about also, is that in many ways, most of my work in one way or the other revolves around the interruption of the progress of modernism, and like kind of what happened before it was interrupted, and kind of the looking at the Bauhaus and the Deutsche Werkbund, which happens to have also influenced the design of this catalog. Mm-hmm. The layout, the very early kind of industrial layout that came out of that time, and then kind of what happened after this huge interruption, and how the experiment of modernism was resumed in some ways after the war.
Yeah, and we don't have a slide of this image, but in your catalog, the checklist is like really inspired by the Deutsche Werkbund. I don't know if you can see that spread, but it's really quite wonderful as a way of kind of almost like the catalog internalizes this history that your work also very much addresses. But you had mentioned that this is monument that's in your hometown. And I always love how casually you reference this hometown, because it's in fact a pretty unique place. If you go to the next slide, you grew up in a town called Worpswede, and it began as an artist colony, or it didn't begin as an artist colony, but at the turn of the 20th century, it was an arts colony that was founded by Heinrich Vogler, who also happened to be your great granduncle. And it was kind of utopian artist community. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about it historically, and then we'll also talk about it in the kind of context of the 60s and 70s when you were growing up there. But I wonder if you could just walk us through what we're looking at. What are these pictures?
For sure, the town of Worpswede is quite unusual, and it's also really hard to pronounce. That's why you see that I'm from northern Germany, which is where Worpswede is located. But here you see a painting by Heinrich Vogler from 1905, which really brings together the group of artists who were becoming very close allies and collaborators at that time. And we are looking here on the very left side of the painting, Paula Modersohn-Becker, who had moved to Worpswede, and then to her right, there's Rainer Maria Rilke, who had also become fascinated by this town and had moved there to then meet his future wife, Clara Rilke-Westhoff, who is sitting on the right side of Paula and Rainer Maria Rilke. And the center of the painting is Martha Vogler, Heinrich Vogler's wife, and then he painted himself into the painting on the right side as a musician. But yeah, it's a fascinating moment in Germany's history, which was also not that well known, but it's a very kind of utopian world where the artists were not just making art, but they were also very much involved in creating the architecture of Worpswede. So there's a train station and the post office and various other buildings that were designed and built by Heinrich Vogler. And then consequently, there are several books that Rainer Maria Rilke wrote about Worpswede, but also about Heinrich Vogler as a person, because he was quite a unique person, to say the least, who later on actually had to flee Germany and moved to Russia, where he lived the last years of his life, and changed his style of work completely into a much more kind of social realist.
And I'm also interested, I know you are too, in the role of women in this artist colony, because you had mentioned Paula Modersohn-Becker. Paula, before she was Modersohn-Becker, was Paula Becker, and she moved to Worpswede in 1898, I believe, and she met and married Otto Modersohn. And if you go to the next slide, just so we have something new to look at. Here's a terrific painting by Paula Modersohn-Becker that's currently on view at the Museum of Modern Art, the 5th floor galleries. But what I think is really interesting to point out is that between the years of 1900 and 1907, which is the year that Modersohn-Becker died, her and Clara Westhoff, who would eventually become Rilke's wife, traveled to Paris on, I think, at least 4 separate occasions. And it was during this time in Paris that Modersohn-Becker's work, and I should mention they traveled kind of without guardians, meaning they didn't travel with their husbands, as far as I understand. They went alone, or they went together, but without a male companion. And it was during this time that Modersohn-Becker's work really changed quite dramatically. I think when in the pre-1900, before her first trip to Paris, she was really painting in almost a post-impressionist style. But when you look at the painting on the right from 1907, I think what you really see is her having digested these kind of the kind of world of the Parisian avant-garde, not only work by Cézanne, but you can see her kind of knowledge of Matisse and the Fauves and also Picasso. And I think I found that to be like a particularly unique situation where you have these two women, you know, kind of again traveling and, you know, kind of on their own without men. And again, it's how what it says about the kind of community of artists that
yeah, I mean, it's almost hard to even imagine or to put in words that, you know, it was actually not allowed for women to go to art school. And Paula then Becker managed to get into the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And from what I saw, you know, in my research, is that the women actually had to pay twice the tuition than the men. But what is really fascinating is how revolutionary and, you know, ahead of their time, both Paula, Modus Becker, and Clara Westhoff were, and how tremendously under-recognized their work was during their lifetime. And, you know, this painting, you know, when I came across it at, you know, the reopening of MoMA, I was just incredibly excited to see this painting that, you know, hasn't really gotten that much recognition until very recently. And so the rediscovery of her work and as the key figure of a German expressionist artist is, I think, quite striking.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think what's interesting is, you know, I mean, this is some again, I'm always struck by your saying, oh, you know, this town that I grew up in, but it's like, this is like pretty hefty, serious history that's kind of formed kind of in the background, or, you know, it's kind of that you kind of, I think, must have always in some ways engaged with. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see very different images of Worpswede. And this is from the 60s and 70s. You spent your early childhood and teenage years, as I understand, in this town with your family. And, you know, apart, or maybe in conjunction with the biographical aspects, I'm also, with your kind of personal biography, I'm also really interested in Worpswede post-war. You know, you were talking about your interest in the interruption of the modernist experiment. And I wonder how you see this town kind of factoring into the kind of larger equation in the pre-World War I, post-World War II, when it became, as far as I can tell, kind of reactivated as a place, as a destination for German artists.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to jump, you know, 60 years from like the beginning of the 20th century to then the 60s and 70s, where, you know, in the meantime, during the war, but especially right, you know, in the years after World War II, a lot of artists from all over Europe and, you know, many regions of Germany found refuge in Worpswede because it had, you know, this kind of like draw that, you know, was very open to, you know, very sort of broad range of intellectual thought, but also provided sort of a safe haven really for a lot of artists. And it's probably one of the few galleries, you know, what we see on the right side, the gallery, Die Insel, the island in English, of a Jewish gallerist reopening in this kind of post-war Germany. And one of his earliest shows was with my father in the 60s, which brought my father really to Worpswede for the first time, to then encounter, you know, all kinds of other artists. And I think I didn't mention this before, but Frank Bowling, the artist, Frank Bowling was also in Germany at various intervals during that time, because he ended up actually marrying my father's first girlfriend. So there was a lot of overlap with not just German artists, but like international artists. And so it's a quite unique place that, yeah, I mean, you know, for me, it was like normal to grow up in this way, but my father also, you know, like Heinrich Vogeler was a very much sort of a Renaissance man who, aside from having, you know, this big train collection that we had in our home, he also had a steam train that he installed next to the actual train tracks in Sweden, and built a steamboat while I was a child. So it was, you know, a different utopian world, but it was also, yeah, like a very specific place to grow up.
Mm-hmm. And just fast forward, you went to university in Berlin, but then in around 1990, you find yourself in what I can only imagine to be, you know, just miles, and not literal, but kind of metaphorical miles away from Worpswede in Southern California, going to CalArts. You're in LA for the first time. And, you know, it's like the city of kind of, it's such an American place. It's also this, you know, Hollywood and spectacle, and how I feel like that experience is so kind of prevalent in your work. If we go to the next slide.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, you know, one thing that, you know, it's also relevant is that CalArts is very much its own microcosm, and, you know, it's much north of LA. So, you know, it's not so much part of LA, but it happened that, you know, when I went to school there, when I graduated that year, that it coincided also with the LA riots, you know, prompted by the terrible trial of the policeman that beat up Rodney King. So there was this kind of moment in, like, you know, American history that I witnessed, and its mediation, and, you know, like seeing this kind of spectacle that was you know, perpetuated on the media, and not really addressing the systemic, you know, issues that were behind the you know, the situation was quite, you know, instrumental and like ground laying for a lot of my work, and prompted me to make my first video work that I shot during the riots that were incited after the trial.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Rodney King beating was, I mean, the violence that was perpetuated there, you know, is something that's very sadly not uncommon. But I think at the time, what was uncommon was that it was captured on video and distributed across the country in various news sources. So it was, you know, one of the first times that or at least in my life, where that was so accessible, you know, made real. And it's interesting to think about how much that influenced your work. And I think you really see these two strains kind of coming together in this film, Mall of America, which is of course much later, from 2009. But I wonder if in the next slide we can show a short clip of it. And just before we start playing, I just want to say it has a low kind of droning soundtrack. And if Josephine, if you feel comfortable, you can maybe talk over it and just explain kind of what we're seeing, and kind of the larger context in which this work was made.
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, this video, you know, obviously also was, you know, bringing in my very European or German perspective into the concept of the mall, which, definitely did not exist where I grew up. So I'm kind of looking at, this monument, basically, which is called the Mall of America in Minneapolis in this film. And at the same time, also looking at that particular moment in time, which was the beginning of the recession, in 2008, and how the military complex was sort of complicit in this moment, or in the way that the mall sort of instrumentalized this moment of despair to draw people into the military. And at the same time, it's also very much within the language of film, and looking at Jean-Luc Godard and Alphaville, where there's like a pivotal scene where one of the characters is using one of these escalators. So it's also kind of referencing film history, really.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is I think as a video, it's like, to me, I find it disturbing, I think, in a way that I imagine it to be purposeful, but you have this kind of failure of capitalism, and then simultaneously this kind of opportunistic or predatory campaign by the military to recruit people who are often, the people without safety nets into kind of to serve in the war in Afghanistan at the time.
It does in a way kind of symbolize, what Giorgio Agamben called the state of exception. It's like creating these, unmanageable situations that kind of get perpetuated and never really, create any kind of safety for the larger population, and it's kind of infinite in its form and nature.
And also, I think what's striking that's here in this video, but also I think is throughout your work, is this idea of this kind of mundane, kind of quotidian everyday life rubbing up against, kind of really difficult images. And in the case of this video, you have these military recruitment videos that you've shot in the mall. But if we go in to the next slide, we have this kind of storefront, not quite a vitrine, more like a storefront situation sculpture of yours, where again you have these everyday objects, and I would even call them, poor objects, or kind of low ranking objects. I don't know, like a dustpan, a toilet brush. These aren't precious things. They're kind of, they're the opposite of precious things. And then that is interrupted by these protest images. And I just wonder, again, it's like it's like the protest images kind of, snap you awake, kind of wake you from this, from what you could, I think, otherwise maybe just kind of glean over. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how this project in particular, but, the kind of ideas behind the inclusion of, kind of everyday items and this kind of protest imagery, how they kind of coincide and live together.
Yeah, it's definitely like a very layered process, that, decided these works, and they're almost kind of like a still from a film that, stretches through like a long time period, and it really kind of starts with Dadaism and Duchamp. Of course, it's an extension of that, very obviously, with the use of the toilet brush and the hot bottle, the hot water bottle and the toilet rug. But then it also kind of stretches, or arches through Walter Benjamin's Arcades project, and sort of like the flaneur, and I kind of juxtapose the flaneur with the protester, that develops sort of simultaneously, or in a sense, like has its heights in the 60s. Mm-hmm. The sort of larger anti-Vietnam and capitalist protests, and then it's also really reconciling the street as a location of.
And just let's go, if we can, to, sorry to interrupt, but just to the next
Sure.
slide, because that really makes the point that I think, the visual point that I think you're about to articulate about the street.
Yeah, I mean, I think here we see the original site-specific version of that vitrine, the way it was installed in 2007. But I think what I've always been really interested in my work is to juxtapose, you know, the street, or it's almost like the theater of the street. It's, you know, it really harks back to like the French Revolution, where like the street was always like the locus of the, you know, the voice of the people, you know, having a voice, you know, in the public. But then, you know, with Industrial Revolution and, you know, the beginning of the first, you know, shopping centers in Paris, and described as, you know, in Walter Benjamin's work, we kind of have the, you know, confluence of the two, and the, you know, the rubbing against each other, and the moment where, you know, people decide that, you know, they really look at these like windows and, you know, bank windows as a target, which really starts primarily, I think, in Seattle in 1997, where, you know, like huge, you know, window fronts were destroyed. But yeah, it's interesting to look back at this early wall built in between that was basically taking over a consumer reporting agency's window that they normally use to present these kind of like, you know, German, everyday kind of consumer items to give them a rating. And my gallery, where I was showing this body of work, happens to be in the same building. So I think it's kind of like data meets, you know, this German sort of pedantic mechanism that is, you know, quite, you know, unparalleled in the world, I would say.
Yeah, you know, when we were, it had occurred to me, and I had sort of forgotten this memory, but in the first time I ever saw your work was in 2006, so a year before this work was made, and it was in the Whitney Biennial. And I was a fellow at the Whitney at the time, so I had to go and give talks of the show. And I remember always talking about your work and talking about it in the way that it had been written about, but always one thing that struck me, I remember there was like, maybe my memory is faulty, I didn't look up the image of the work, but there was like a leg and maybe some hosiery like display, and then next to it was some sort of paper with like this very kind of Germanic font. And to me, it was almost like a three-dimensional collage, and kind of had a Dadaist sensibility, almost like a, you know, like if you took a Hannah Höch collage and made it three-dimensional, and that, you know, that it kind of, it was interesting in its relation to, and again, I was a graduate student at the time, so it's like my head was in kind of very much in history, but it was a kind of interesting dialogue with this kind of interwar period in Germany. And I don't know whether that was something that you were thinking about at all, or whether that's just, you know, a reading I'm kind of applying to something that may not be there at all.
Yeah, I think it was actually a Quran, I think, that you saw in that installation, the between Tout va bien, which is also has a title from the Godard film. But I think it was, it was a reference. Oh no, it was the other between. It's literally the title of the piece is the complete history of post-contemporary art. So it's kind of anticipating a sort of non-existent art category in the future, sort of like postmodernism. And, you know, I made up this term post-contemporary art, and I stamped that on a very old Quran that I had found in Istanbul many years before.
And you had also mentioned, I mean, just a moment ago, you were talking about the protests, but also the relation to the streets. And I think you had brought up 1968 and the student protests that happened then. And I think it's also worth mentioning the kind of German dimension there. If we go to the next slide, 1968 was really the early, we don't have to play it yet, but really the early years of the Red Army faction, or some often referred to as the Baader Meinhof group or the Baader Meinhof gang that grew out of the student protest movement. And in 1960, well, let's watch for people that are maybe less familiar with this. This is an excerpt from just a BBC documentary, very short, that'll just kind of help us situate this in place and time.
How can we allow them to murder in our name? We have demonstrated once too often in an orderly, appropriate, and unsuccessful fashion. We have had enough of providing the veneer of democracy.
We would try to join up with other people, and I think we despised what our parents had created. We were angry that we had to live with a past like that. Our generation was in love with the revolution.
Und dass man versucht, das mit sich fertig zu bringen.
In society, the system has managed to drag the masses so deeply into their own crap that they seem to have lost any feeling for their position as exploited and oppressed, so that they dream of nothing more than a car, a holiday, and a tiled bathroom.
Yeah, and I think, I think that this kind of 68 student movement across Europe and elsewhere, but had a really interesting dimension in Germany that kind of brought forth the Red Army faction, and that is the relationship between these kind of generation of young people that were born usually during the were young during the war, and then really
Born after the war, yeah.
Born after the war, or born at the tail end of the war, but a generation of people that were really angry and disillusioned with Germany's past, but also its glossing over of the past. As you had mentioned, all these former Nazis were in, political positions of power. There was the German economic miracle of the 1950s that sort of restored, I think, a lot of daily life. You saw that at the end, the kind of department store kind of scenes, that you wouldn't have guessed necessarily that 15, 18 years prior, it was the, what a different place Germany had been. And I think that's important too, that you lived through, you were very young in 1968, but later in the late 70s, you lived through a period called the German Autumn, which was a moment when the Red Army faction managed to pull off acts of politically motivated violence. And I feel like that also is something that's referenced in your work, and we'll see that in the next slide in the way that you curated the show at Frac. So once again, we're looking at that same image, just from a different angle, of the Clairefontaine brick, the vitrine, and then just to the right of the vitrine is a charcoal drawing of Ulrike Meinhof, who's one of the founding members of the, Baader Meinhof. Half of that name comes from Andreas Baader, the other from Ulrike Meinhof. And I wonder if you just wanted to talk a little bit about this image, but also its inclusion in the show.
Yeah, I think it's it's really interesting to look at the clip that we just watched in connection, in correlation to the George Floyd killing, as some of the actions really that the RAF group executed were prompted by very specific things. So the department store arson in Frankfurt, for example, was prompted by the killing of a student in Berlin. His name was Benno Ohnesorg, and he was killed by a police officer in 1967. So I think the backdrop really was also a population, at least, half of the population who was very upset about the police violence in Germany and the, as you said, structural, issues with formerly or still, kind of Nazi influence, highly, high executives in the government. And so in this exhibition, it was, interesting when I stumbled upon the Johannes Kahrs drawing of Ulrike Meinhof, who really was the intellectual, leader of the group. And, the group itself actually was comprised of a lot of women. I think the majority were actually women. And as a side note, I was also very familiar with, her history and her name, as my aunt on my mother's side was very close friends with her. So it's, there's a slightly different approach when you look at artworks that deal with this, very kind of, difficult era in Germany, when you kind of know some of the backstories. Mm-hmm. So I was really interested in, creating this moment of, fragility in some ways, and, the juxtapositioning of the brick, the Clairefontaine brick, the vitrine that kind of references art history and kind of like interrupted, experiment of modernism. And then the drawing of Ulrike in this very compromised moment where she's already in jail at Stammheim prison.
So maybe we can go to the next slide just to get a closer look at the drawing and also Stammheim.
The prison really is, like the highest security prison ever built in Germany. And it was this kind of spectacle around, their capture and several, attempts from the Bader-Meinhof group to set them free or to, sort of extort them through the hijacking of airplanes and so forth. It was a very kind of, a moment where, the media sort of became very much involved in, how this was handled. But I think it's kind of like the only moment in my exhibition where I deliberately chose to show a female body being depicted by a male artist, which was, very decisively not the case in the rest of the exhibition. It's a very interesting element in the show.
And if we go to the next slide, these are on the left, you'll see 3 paintings. These are also paintings of Ulrike Meinhof. After she killed herself, hung herself in her cell in Stammheim. And you had mentioned the way that this was treated in the media. So these are on the left paintings by Gerhard Richter. On the right is a source material, which is a forensic photograph of Meinhof after she was, taken down and her body was placed on the ground. And you can see it was reproduced in this is one example of it in a newspaper, but it was really distributed quite widely across a range of publications, and the kind of immediacy of that. So Richter, in his, I think, kind of characteristic way, takes this immediacy of this photograph, these stark whites and stark blacks, the kind of quickness of the readability of that photographic image, and transforms it into something, in my opinion, something else entirely different by, it's almost a process that I can best describe as veiling. First of all, he expands the range. It's no longer, black, white, and a few grays. It's mostly shades of gray. And then in his very signature style, he really obscures the image itself by brushing over its surface to give it this kind of blurriness that makes the body the image of this dead person even harder to access. And I think also kind of introduces a different type of, or induces a different type of seeing.
But it's also, I think, fascinating when you look at Richter and sort of, his atlas work and, the amazing compilations of images of post-war Germany, and then think about Hannah Darboven and how she, processed the entire trauma of German history in her extremely complex work, especially in cultural history, 1889 to 1983, that includes a lot of passages and imagery from the magazine Der Spiegel. So I think, comparing these two artists and how they approach German history is always been really fascinating to me.
And trauma. German history and the kind of trauma kind of embedded in it. Just in the next slide, you'll see that these, that Richter's meditation on this, those are 3 paintings that are part of a 15 painting series. It's all one work called October 18th, 1977. And on that date, 3 members of the Red Army faction were found dead in their cells in Stahnheim. And the series itself is a kind of rumination on, and Richter focuses on specific events, in a short, specific events in the history of the Red Army faction, and then the subsequent deaths of the key members. And this is currently on view at the Museum of Modern Art and just through Sunday. So, if this sounds interesting, I think it's worth going to look at, because as I was saying, his approach to painting, they're all based on photographic material, but really transformed in such a way that it really asks you to slow down because of how inaccessible the images are. I think purposefully so. You have to really stand there and spend time with them, and there's a kind of slowness to viewing a work like this. But I think we're kind of running out of time, so I think we should end with this last work of yours in the next slide, called Sabotage on Auto Assembly Line to Slow It Down, from 2009. This is a really large sculpture that was also included in the Frac show, and I just, I'm curious about this work and kind of different ways of display or different kind of elements that you've used.
I think, in a very different way than the Richter installation that you have up at the museum, this work really addressed the term slowdown, which is a method that union strikers use instead of doing a full-on strike. So it kind of really speaks about the collapse of the American car industry in 2008, similar to the Mall of America. This is from a time period where, we were going into this kind of deep recession, but, it also, really points out to the instability in general of sort of the post-Fordian society. And the installation, has this big sort of mirror component in this conveyor belt, which kind of signifies the production chain and the car tires, but it also includes 2 videos on the right side. One is a collage of car commercials from around that time that are like stunningly militaristic and upsetting, but it also has as an element, when we go to the next slide, a video of a shattered screen, which I guess you described as a trombleu, work, because it's not the screen, but it's the video that creates this kind of shatter, broken in glass. And in a way, kind of to sum up some of the earlier points that we were making, that at this moment where we are all kind of facing this, incredibly difficult time, and the fragility of, the moment and the changes maybe that need to happen in terms of inequality and systematic, inequality in this country, but also how, social media is complicit in a lot of these like hugely problematic issues. Kind of, I feel like the screen, this broken screen, which we are also familiar with our broken iPhones, really kind of symbolizes the issues around social media and the constant presence of the screen.
Yep. And I think maybe we can end there, but I also just want to point out that it's, this is from 2009. So there's there's something very prescient about it, because although social media was around, it wasn't the kind of ever present kind of entity that it is today. But we can play the video, and then, if there are any questions, we're happy to answer a few of them.
Yeah, it has this kind of static white noise, very post-apocalyptic thing.
Wonderful. Margaret, I know you're gonna, if there are Q&As, I know Margaret was gonna help moderate.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't see any questions yet, but I was thinking something that kind of stuck out to me. I'll just go ahead and ask about. I know Paulina, you mentioned how Josephine's work at the Whitney kind of reminded you of a three-dimensional collage, and I thought it was interesting too, the mention of Benjamin and how he discussed how to make literature into a collage as well. And so there's also this really amazing artist book from 1959 called Memoir with it's Guy Debord and Oscar Jorn in collaboration together, and that's also a collage work. And so I wonder, Josephine, if you could maybe speak a little bit more to even the idea. I know your work has this vitrine element, but I wonder if the vitrine could maybe even be seen as like a 3D collage in some way. I don't know if I'm reaching.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think a lot of people think, a lot of people who haven't seen the works in person perceive it as a collage, where in reality it's a lot more probably related to film, because it's much more kind of like a frozen moment of society. It's like I think I'm really interested in capturing a moment of history and kind of creating a snapshot of something that is going to disappear, and kind of creating these narratives in my mind with sometimes life-size sculptures that in person are a lot more physically present and less kind of collage-like than they might seem as an illustration.
Yeah, you've talked a lot about narrative, actually, like in our preparation, and that there's like a pretty strong narrative component to your work, which isn't immediately obvious, but I think the more time that you spend on it, like over, as we've been, kind of thinking about what images to use in preparation for today, I started kind of, beginning to see narrative, maybe not a linear narrative, but more in the terms of this word constellation that you that you've been using, and I think seems very kind of apt in terms of the way that you can kind of meander amongst these images and objects and sort of, you know, this kind of history folding back on itself and looking forward while looking back. I don't know, it seems, I mean, especially maybe that this is not particularly articulate, but it's like an impression that I got from looking at both especially the installation shots at the show at the Frac, but then also, you know, in our a
lot of the ideas, you know, come through, you know, the reading of, you know, contemporary philosophy, or, you know, looking at film history, and then the manifestations of the work sometimes, you know, are very highly produced, you know, especially the vitrines. So it can sometimes appear that the work has much more of a unique or sort of autonomous quality, where in my mind, they are all connected through a narrative that, you know, essentially only I really know, but like, you know, giving this kind of glimpse into my family background, I think might enlighten some of that, but it's, you know, it's, yeah, it's not really necessarily supposed to be traceable. And I think, you know, I'm also writing, you know, I'm actually writing poetry. I'm not, you know, necessarily like a didactic artist who's making work about something to, you know, convey a certain meaning or to lecture people on anything. It's much more kind of open-ended, and it's more, you know, related to fiction in some ways than to didacticism.
Yeah. Great.
But thank you all for watching, and thank you, Paulina. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Margaret and Josephine. It's been a pleasure to think through some of these works with you. So.
Yeah, thank you both so much for your time. We really appreciate it. This has been a really, really interesting conversation. And you can also purchase the book at Print and Matter as well. It's a great overview of the exhibition. It's really interesting and it's really beautifully done. So I think that's it for the night. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.